Welcome to the Business Seller Center Expert Interview Series. Today we're talking with Jeff Swiggett about how buyers value your business. And this is one of the 4 conversations with Jeff about preparing to exit and maximizing your business value when it's time to sell. I'm Kevin Murray, and I'm your host today. Jeff Swiggett is an award-winning business sales expert and certified intermediary, experienced in negotiation, business valuations, deal structures, deal terms, and exit strategies. He's the owner of VR Business Sales in New Haven, a business brokerage providing exceptional merger and acquisition advisory services to companies in Connecticut, Southern New England, and Metro New York. Jeff is one of the few business brokers in New England that has secured the prestigious designations of Certified Business Intermediary from the International Business Brokers Association and a Mergers and Acquisition Master Intermediary from the M&A Source. He's also a member of the Board of Directors for the M&A Source and is the organization's chairperson for 2022. VR Business Sales was named by the M&A Source as the top 2 to 5 person M&A advisory firm for 2020, and it received the M&A Source Platinum Award for conducting over $15 million of transactions in 2021. As part of Jeff's work in helping sellers understand the value of their business, Jeff created a risk adjustment factor matrix that evaluates each business on its management dependency, financial controls, the end markets that they serve, customer concentration, the supplier base, and the competition. Not only does this help uncover deeper strengths or weaknesses that buyers will find, this tool can also be a guide for business owners in their exit preparation to increase the business value before you go to market. We're including a free download with this matrix on this page. All right, we're back today with Jeff Swiggett from VR Nutmeg, one of the most successful business brokers over the last dozen years or more. And today we're going to be talking about a couple additional topics. And these things really, I think they have a couple purposes. One purpose is to help the seller see what buyers are going to be thinking about and looking at when they evaluate your business. So these are things you can actually work on a little bit, either before you go to market or as you're preparing to go to market. And these are also, I think, Jeff originally created these as an additional tool for doing valuations of small privately held companies, because the traditional valuation techniques focus a lot on the numbers and the earnings. And Jeff felt that wasn't quite enough and added in 6 other perspectives. And that's what we're diving into in this series of interviews. So we talked about a few last time. Today, we're going to be talking about the end markets. So that's the markets the business is selling into, their products and the services. And the other notion we're going to talk about is the customer concentration. And I'm going to let Jeff explain his terms for that a little bit more. And at the end, we're going to just talk a little bit about Jeff's experiences and exposure in terms of the pandemic effects. What's that done to the business market, business for sale market? What's that done for buyers' perspectives? So that's a really timely and fascinating topic we'll touch on. So hello again, Jeff.
Hey, Kevin, how are you?
All right.
Welcome back.
We've got a
Happy to be back.
Yeah, I think we've got a heat misery index situation here in the Northeast. So I thought having a nice background here would help a little bit. But yeah, they say it's over 100 between the heat and the humidity, which in case you weren't miserable enough thinking it was 92, it's over 100 with the index. So let's just jump in and we'll talk about the end markets. And as we did on the other topics, I'd love you to just give us a sense of what you mean by that and kind of flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah. So often depending upon where all businesses have revenues, you're always wondering where those revenues are coming from. And so I think it's really the end markets of your clients, the business's clients, that sort of define kind of, the potential of the business. So it's important to understand, who not only who your customers are, but what they're selling into in terms of what their markets are for their products or services. So if you're in a growing, they're in a growing end market, then that's better than if you're selling to clients that are in a stagnant end market or a declining end market that has problems. Will create some problems for you in terms of trying to achieve growth targets or grow the business, or do all the things that buyers like to see in terms of when they buy a business. So it's important to sort of really analyze that.
All right, great.
Qualitatively, it'll affect, if you got a lot of business, but it's declining because your clients' markets are declining, then that'll weigh heavily on your value. That'll weigh to some extent on your valuation,
All right,
in terms of how we market,
Okay. Yeah, I had for about 20 years, I was marketing to industrial customers in Connecticut, and I had an awareness that was a shrinking pond, between
right.
Seeing my customers outsourcing, shipping their factories overseas, just layoffs over, 10, 20
right.
years. So, yeah. So I like what you said. You mentioned the word potential, because a lot of valuations are kind of backward looking. We look at the history over the last few years, but I like that notion of potential, because in the buyer's mind, they might have some strengths in a market that you didn't just crack as a seller. They might have some other ways of approaching it. So even if you're in a market that's growing or declining, a buyer might see some potential there because what they're bringing to bear, their expertise.
Right.
But, all right, great. So do you have, again, from your history, an example of a business that was, moving into a real growth market, and that gave them a better, appeal to the buyer, and maybe a business that was in a market that was declining, and how did that impact the kind of the discussions with buyers?
Yeah, I think I've had sold a number of businesses over the years whose, the prospects look good, and it's really, that's why they were getting purchased. So I think
Right.
And they were fortunately, I think particularly the private equity community, the private equity community really, their goals and their investment objectives are largely determined by how they can grow a business and how they grow a business that they acquire. So either they're going to bring some support to it, or they're going to buy businesses that are in markets where that potential can be realized. So, I think there are a number of different types of end markets that are growing. I mean, and it doesn't have to, manufacturing firms can be, even though that's not necessarily an expanding presence in the U.S. I mean, depending upon here in Connecticut, for instance, there's a sort of a strong aerospace presence, and up until very recently, before the pandemic, that had been perceived by kind of the investment community as a terrific market to be in, because most of these guys, most of these aerospace suppliers are very, very busy, and couldn't keep up with demand. And so I think, I actually sold a contract machine shop, basically in Connecticut, that was selling about half of its business in the aerospace industry. And that had real appeal in terms of the buyers of that business. And, I'd say somebody who is in the declining markets, for instance, over the years, we've sold a number of printers, right? Printers are, everything is going digital. The markets for printers is really dominated, and the sale of printing businesses are dominated by bigger printers who are gobbling up really revenues of smaller printers. And that's the way they're growing. And I think they're not paying a lot of money for it. They're really just paying, they're given and sellers don't have a lot of negotiating power, what they can, get demand out of a seller, a buyer to pay for it. So, I think it all depends. That's sort of you can still get it sold. You just got to kind of understand where you'll be sitting there in terms of sort of the valuation number.
Yeah. Well, actually, what I take away from what you said, Jeff, is there's big, huge categories like manufacturing, and then inside of that, and this is part of our work as a broker or an intermediary, is understanding, the segments, the markets, the demographics they serve, maybe the region that they're in. There's a lot of other pieces. Like not every aerospace company is going to be the same. If they're making parts for a 50-year-old 727 versus the latest, Pratt and Whitney engines that are coming off the line.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, and that's true. Even if they're selling into aerospace, I mean, a really good buyer, what they're going to look at is, okay, what segments of the aerospace are they selling into, and if it happens to be planes or whatever it may be else, they're going to want to know which planes they're selling into, which models, and what are the prospects for those models going forward, and so I think it's really good buyers, particularly out of the private equity community. They're going to do a very deep dive in terms of what, where the revenue is coming from and what are the prospects for that revenue going forward,
Great. And I also think about as a component of the book, like we're going to write up a book about the company, and it's got different names, the confidential information memorandum, or, this 20, 30, 40 page story about the company. That idea about the potential, I think, is really valuable to help the buyer from the inside information. Like, well, here's what we've done. Here's some things that we think we'd like to do, but maybe it takes a next level of investment. It's going to take the next owner to take it there. But the seller actually probably has a really good idea of some of those potentials. And that's part of our job, to make sure that gets communicated to buyers, so they don't have to, it's not all on them to imagine the future.
Right. Exactly.
All right, good. So I'm just thinking, like, what markets have you sold any businesses in the last 5 years or so that were in kind of declining markets, but they were still able to have a successful sale?
Yeah,
putting you on the spot here, Jeff.
Exactly. I mean, all things being equal, I mean, I just soon not, it's hard working with those kinds of businesses, because I think it is a, I think we've had more where, I did sell a business a couple of years ago that, and I don't want to disclose what market it was selling into, but it was a market that is also being sort of replaced by the digital economy, right? I mean, it's sort of printing related, but it's a services to a printing related business.
Okay. So there,
I think it was, I think it had to be with the right buyer. Yeah. And that's the whole thing. I mean, I think once you begin to sort of put limitations on kind of who and how and who's going to benefit from buying somebody who's selling into declining markets, it's probably someone who's or some entity that is they're not looking to overpay for that prospect. And so I think you can get it sold, but you have to have reasonable expectations in terms of the way you think you're going to sell it.
Okay. Well, again, that's why I like the overall kind of logic of this whole risk adjustment factors model that you created, that we're sharing about, because you do just the straight economic analysis. You may or may not pick up some of these finer points that you're sharing with us here.
Right.
So
I mean, for instance, I could do about, we can do sort of standard comps review and or an SIC code that covers a contract manufacturer selling into the aerospace industry. That doesn't always, I can identify a bunch of comp sales that way through our own databases. It doesn't always tell you the difference between one who's selling into the latest contract of, engines for the F-35 or something like that, versus one who's supporting older systems.
Sure.
The one who's supporting the newer systems with better contracts, better long-term growth potential, ought to receive a boost to their valuation for that.
All right, great. Yeah, and again, that's really one of the big purposes of your whole risk adjustment factors, is that you can have a system, a mechanism to say, because of this, we're going to give them we're going to goose the value because we recognize their markets are growing, or we're going to ding them because their markets are shrinking.
Right.
All right, great. So again, we've kind of covered this a little bit, but how much does it take for you to kind of research this? Does this come from the seller or a combination of the two of you, or?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, when we do a very sort of simple opinion of value, right? I mean, you're familiar with what we do. We're not, we do these sort of on a courtesy basis. We don't charge it. It really gives the owners a chance to get to know us, and frankly, a chance for me to get to know their business, and which I think is important in terms of understanding, how successful I think an engagement is going to be to their benefit and to our benefit.
Right.
And so I think that what I like to really get a handle on, aside from their sort of 5 years worth of financials, is sort of an understanding of what the revenue streams look like, who their customers are.
Yep.
Have a general discussion with the seller about that.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty quickly we can get a sense about just the things we're talking about right here. How difficult this will be, or how advantageous it'll be to represent them, and what the effect will be on their valuation. Yep. So, it takes a bit of work to assemble some of that information, but not a lot of work. I think we just have to have some characterization of it a little bit.
Well, again, I've learned, how much time and work it takes when you're bringing somebody to market. And just to reinforce something you said, Jeff, to have those conversations up front with the seller to kind of establish expectations. If they think they're going to market for 5 million and maybe they're worth $1 million because they're in a declining market, they don't have the management, they don't have, there's these kind of issues. That would be a waste of a lot of good time for you.
Right.
to go get them an offer for $1.2 million, which you think is great, and they're thinking it's horrible. So
right.
the transparency early on and up front, because this is a long-term engagement that we make with the seller, and there's a lot of work and a lot of time, a lot of hand-holding over 6 to 12 months or more to get the deal.
Yeah, that, and I think it's really often when we're talking to people about valuing their business, it may be the first time they're getting somebody to talk to them about that, right? So I think it's depending upon where they are in their life cycle, with the business, our comments, either positive or negative, may be able to. It may give them some indication of, if they don't want to sell now, then this is what they need to do to improve value. If that's an important thing for them, it's not always the most important thing for somebody.
Yeah. Well, that's one of
they know where they stand, and
Sure.
That's kind of what it allows them to have a data point there to do some planning.
Right. That's one of the things I really like, and it's kind of a dual purpose, maybe beyond what you're using it for, the risk factor adjustments. You're looking at it as a valuation component. I think it's a really smart assessment tool for a business that maybe they're thinking about time to retire or a good time to sell, but they're not quite ready. So these are the things that are going to point to value adders or value detractors. If you go to market the way you are today and you don't touch these, that's going to have an impact. But you can impact all of these areas given enough time, maybe given a little investment, and it'll make a big difference in the price you get.
I mean, this is our 15th year in business, or just started our 15th. And so I talk to people that I probably did some kind of valuation from 8 or 9 years ago, and they'll pull that out of the drawer and say, all right, Jeff, I'm ready to go. So I think, I think they were able to sort of coast along those years between the time I first talked to them and the time they're ready to go. And I think with some understanding of what that meant when they're ready to go. Right. So I think it's not a surprise, and that's a good way. So I encourage all owners just to sit down and have conversations with guys like you and me, to get that in, even if they're, 4 or 5 years away from beginning to think about exiting,
Oh yeah. And again, there's the longer runway you have, the better, the more relaxed it is. If you've got to sell in 12 months, it's going to be hectic, and there's not a whole lot you can do to improve some of these factors. Yeah. If you've got a couple, 3, 4, 5 years, you can approach these, without making yourself crazy.
Right.
So yeah, like this one, I think you've touched on it with a couple of your comments already, but how does this impact the buyer perspective on the business? I mean, like you said, it's different with private equity types of buyers. They're looking to grow and scale something so they can, earn a return 5 years down the road or so. What about for, smaller buyers, private buyers? How does this impact, again, the question we've asked before, how does this impact like the multiplier, if that's,
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, look, I'm all, depending upon what level of earnings, I'm always saying, you can sell that business for, 3 times owner cash flow. Right. So, if you have a business that's selling into, lousier markets, declining markets, it might be, less than 2 times that number. If you're selling into sort of rapidly growing, you've got a good set of customers, it might, you might sell it for 3.5 to 4 times that number. So I think it all, it can impact the view on it that way a little bit. So it can have a pretty significant impact, in terms of trying to understand that.
All right, great. So just to throw some numbers at that, for a company that's doing $500,000 of owner earnings or adjusted EBITDA, whatever number we're looking at, you're saying it could be a spread from like 2 to 4, 2 to 4 times the multiplier. So that's taking it from $1 million to $2 million. That's a huge range. And I think that the investment to try to tackle some of those issues is just going to be a fraction of that. And I think about, again, for most companies in most markets, if their markets are declining, it's actually not so hard to make a move to an adjacent market or pick a different demographic that does have a growth uptick, and they don't have to change their processing, their manufacturing, their cost of goods might not change. It might just be a marketing pivot. So, but yeah, you can't do that in a hurry though. You're going to have to take a little time to grow a market and, find your way in there. All right, great. So any other thoughts about, the end markets that our sellers are selling into and how that, creates either risk or potential opportunity for buyers?
Yeah, it's always better to be selling on a growing end market. Right. I mean, I guess that's pretty intuitive, right? And so as a consequence, it's, it helps your valuation.
Yeah.
So I think, and selling into a declining end market is not as much fun.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So it hurts valuation that way.
It's like Jeff's rules of business.
Right.
Sell into a growing market.
That seems to me pretty obvious, right? I mean,
Horse and buggy whip companies. We're not going to represent.
Exactly.
Probably. I mean, we'll see.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you for that. So the second category is about customer concentration. And again, I'm going to let you roll off this topic with your kind of definition of that.
Yeah. So I think often you see this with smaller business. You see this a lot in Connecticut, in terms of speaking of the contract machining business, I think often and there are a lot of them in Connecticut, and there's an active market for buying these companies, but I think that, and selling them. But typically, a lot of these guys will have, 70% of their revenues may be tied up with 2 or 3 customers, and one of them may have 30 or 40% of the total revenues.
Wow.
And so I think there's just a good deal of risk associated with it. And it may not seem that way to the seller, but I guarantee it's going to be viewed that way by the buyer. In other words, if these have been even long-time customers, that the seller just sort of assumes, hey, they're going nowhere. They've been, they've just. I think a buyer is always going to approach these things very skeptically and be worried about the fact that when they take the business over, the buyer may flee with it. And so I think that's, and it's, this is true, that condition is true. A lot of these companies. So it's not, I think what you have to take a look at is how are buyers going to mitigate that risk and really assess the risk associated with some of these, some of their more important clients. And that'll impact both their sense of what they're willing to pay for it and how they're willing to pay for it. Yeah. In other words, it's not just the valuation. It's really often with customer concentration. It's we'll give you 60-70% cash at closing, and the balance is going to be earned out over some period of time, as long as these customers stay around for a little while,
Great. I was just going to actually ask.
Backside.
I was going to ask about that kind of scenario you just exactly pointed to. It's a little bit off topic, but not really, because it's going to impact not just the value of the deal, but the terms of the deal. And that's another really smart thing. If we can appreciate early on in the engagement with the seller, it's like, you got a lot of clients in this bin here. Good on you to have them, but the buyers are going to maybe be skeptical. They might want to bring you a contingent offer or with some kind of retainage or some kind of earn out based on performance. So to tell them that, which is likely, in advance, is way better than, oh, it's time to review letters of intent and these guys are throwing this thing in there. So yeah, that's because you've seen it enough. That's a valid topic to bring up early on in an engagement about what.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's it's important to have those discussions up front, and I think it's important to give people kind of a keen understanding of the fears of the buyer and how they're going to try to mitigate those fears, and certainly all the people advising them on their side is going to address that. So you just have to be prepared for it.
Yeah. No, I had a situation last year with a seller that went to work with a different broker, and I think that they didn't have a good enough conversation about customer concentration. Fast forward a year later, that's what blew up the deals when the buyers were doing the due diligence, and they're like, wow, you've got like 45% of your customers are coming from this one place.
Right.
And that really scared them. That wasn't talked about. And it was like really clear to see, like the sellers knew it,
right?
But the broker kind of didn't want to talk about it, just wanted to take their listing. Bottom line, they're still not sold. Whereas if the expectations could have been set appropriately at the beginning, they either would have, they might have made a different decision about how they were going to go to market, who they were going to go to market with, or again, just have some reality around their expectations.
Right. And actually some of the least risky business I've sold are the ones that are those with a big spread of customers. The best business I ever sold, 15 years, is really a driveway sealing business that had 10,000 active customers.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't a big, it was a good, nice sized business, but was servicing kind of 9 contiguous towns in the Fairfield County area. And, those 10,000 active customers would get their driveway sealed once every 3 years. And, they just got on a schedule and they were sealing 3,500 driveways a year. And so it's, no one accounted more than like for 0.001% of the revenue. So
you lose a customer, not a big deal.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think it's, that's the kind of thing you have to think about. So we got all cash at closing, a good multiple, yada, yada, yada on that business.
Very good. So what about any illustrations on the opposite side, Jeff, where you had a seller that had a really high concentration of a customer or in a market?
Yeah, so I think I've sold a number of contract machining operations, and that's often where you get it. And there's a couple things that happened. I mean, we did get the one I sold more recently. Probably got about 70% cash at closing. The balance was paid out over 3 years, depending upon revenue performance. Yep. And also importantly, this is the other thing you have to tell people, sellers of these kinds of businesses, and whether it's manufacturing or any other business that has it, is that just prior to closing the transaction, the buyer actually interviewed their key clients, went and met with them along with the seller. That's a sort of a touchy situation in terms of pre-closing where sellers don't want to do that. But I think it's I think the reality is I've seen that happen a number of times, and I think that's going to be a condition of anybody with heavy customer concentration that they're going to want to speak to their clients just prior to closing to make sure that the client all of a sudden doesn't hit them with a surprise like, oops, we're out of that program now, or we were planning to switch vendors or whatever it may be. Because that's real, and that has happened.
Well, again, when you put on your buyer hat, which is part of what we have to do on behalf of our sellers, it's like, oh, you've got 25% of your revenue and earnings comes from this client. I think I want to talk with him before I buy your business. Right. It's like almost like, duh. Yeah, I think that's really important. So, again,
and I will also add an editorial comment on that. Every time I've done that, where the seller has been exceptionally nervous about doing that.
Yeah.
What happens is they jointly meet with their client, with the buyer and the seller, and the client inevitably says, "You know what? I'm really glad you brought me in on this conversation, and I'm glad to know that you're doing this." And of course, we're going to support them in whatever way to continue the business. But I appreciate the giving us the heads up and doing all that, because so there's a sort of a positive aspect to that. And I think if you think about your clients, generally they don't want to have to switch vendors if they don't have to. The reason you're going to switch a vendor is because you've given them some reason to do it. You've punished them by you've been delivering lousy parts or providing lousy service over the years, and so they're gonna. But I think with a new seller coming in, a new buyer coming in, what they want to know is the program's not going to disappear because of some exogenous kind of event, and I think they want to try to understand who they really are that they're getting in bed with here. So I think for those kinds of businesses where you don't have a big spread in customers, just get your head. I tell sellers to get their head around having to having to reveal themselves a little bit about what they're doing.
I love that story, but it's also part of it. Like for the seller, like we're not bringing 40 different buyers in to meet with your customers. Right. It might be the one that you've already decided is the best offer, the best terms. They've done the due diligence. This is like a pre-closing condition, and then we go to close. So there's a lot of quality checks on the way before you get there, and there's a lot of weeding out. Like I was talking with a potential client today. So I might talk with 40, 50 buyers before you get somebody that's like, yeah, I like this company. I want to make an offer. And that's, not everybody's going to do the due diligence and talk to your client.
Right.
It might just be one that's very,
and actually to clarify that, generally we only do that if there's a asset purchase agreement signed and they're about 2 weeks away from closing. Usually we schedule it at that time.
Yeah, it's very much.
So it's a lot of stuff that's already happened prior to that happening.
Yeah. So it's almost, we'll do this on the way to the bank, and then we'll do the closing at noon. We'll talk to
it's sort of one of the contingencies of the contract. Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Great. Yeah. So again, I would imagine, the buyer's perspective, they're going to be, willing to pay more. The multiple will be higher, the broader the customer base is. And if you're really concentrated in with a couple clients, that's risk. That's risk for the buyer. They're not going to pay as much, or to your point, they'll defer some of the payment. You're not going to take it as cash at closing. So
So exactly.
It represents risks, and the buyers are risk managers. They know how to manage their risk.
Right.
They'll either offer you less, or they'll just make you wait for it.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, the last topic, and I just kind of threw this one in at the last minute, but we've been having this conversation with a lot of our buyers and sellers, is about pandemic effects. So things have changed a whole lot for a whole lot of businesses in the last, 2.5 years. So just would love to kind of hear your thoughts on some of the bigger things that you've seen, or kind of how this has affected your approach to sellers, and how you've seen buyers behave differently.
Yeah, I think it's created a lot of problems in our business in terms of trying to divine value out of clearly. I've had companies where they weren't affected by the pandemic at all. In other words, their business continued to do well, and in which case it's not an issue. But I would say most of them, I would say 50-60% of them got impacted in some way, so that 2020 and 2021, there were some real negative effects to their business. So I think the question is buyers now sort of accept the fact that everybody got whacked in 2020 for the entire year, basically. And so that's an extraneous year. I think what they want to see is that starting midway through 2021, on a monthly basis, their revenues began to track back up.
Yeah.
And by early 2022 and certainly at this point, maybe the revenues are back to where they were pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
And so I think if they can see that, then I think they can see some sustainability to the story.
Right.
You'll get back to valuations that you would have had if you sold your business in 2019. So you don't get penalized by it so much,
Right. Yeah, we've got some things that we're working on together where clients got a big hit, but we also have one or two that I'm thinking of where there was a big boost due to the pandemic.
Yes.
And it's kind of the opposite issue.
Right.
It's kind of like, okay, you had some really great years, but are those sustainable?
Right. Yes, that's exactly it. I mean, yes, right. It has worked in reverse. And, I think it adds some complications to a sale, right? I mean, anytime I gotta tell a more complicated story about a business, I mean, the more difficult it is not necessarily get the valuation, but it's getting paid up front on that valuation, right? So I think it's really what the terms of a deal may be. It's not. It's much easier if I take a business to market where the last 5 years showed a very sort of steady, kind of predictable revenue and income stream that is being delivered sort of currently. And then, the risk assessment is pretty straightforward, and what they're willing to pay for is pretty straightforward. But, that's the whole pandemic kind of threw a loop in a lot of that, because, I mean, I have a firm right now where we're selling where their sales kind of went up around 40% during the pandemic, and they're still there. I mean, they're still, their sales in 2022 are still way ahead of where they were in 2019 even. And so the issue we're having is people trying to believe whether even out of the pandemic at this point, whether these things are still sustainable,
Yeah.
So
I had
it's
client.
just complicated.
Yeah. But the issue though, I think, is helping the seller tell the story so that we in turn can tell the story to the buyer. So like what happened, what's going to be the same, what's going to be different. So this one client had this huge pandemic bump. They got tremendous growth in sales, but they didn't have a story to say other than, we got a big bump from COVID. They weren't able to say we had a plan, or here's where we executed, and here's how we're going to continue that growth, or here's where. So by the time they showed up in front of the buyers, they just didn't have a really good story to say about, that why sales went up or why sales went down and what we're going to do with it. So that notion of really understanding the business, being able to explain that on behalf of the seller to the buyers and say, so here's what happened, here's what we've seen, here's what we're doing about it, and anticipate how they're going to look at all these risk factors that we're talking about, because we know they're going to be thinking along these lines.
Yes,
so let's talk about them, instead of waiting for them to bring them up.
Exactly.
Right. Great. Great. Well, again, I've used your risk adjustment factors on every business that I'm looking at and every valuation that I'm doing, and it's a really great place to have a conversation with people. It's a great tool to ask some extra questions of the sellers to understand what they think about the business they're in, the markets they're in, the clients they serve, what they think about their finances. So just one last question in this category about pandemic effects. So there's impacts on the sellers, there's impacts on the buyers. What about the bankers? Because for the smaller mid-market, there's a lot of SBA lending that's facilitating these deals where private equity, hedge funds, family offices, they don't need any money. But for deals, let's say under 5-10 million, maybe, below that range, there's likely an SBA loan. What do you see that the bankers are doing now in terms of the pandemic effects? How has it changed what they want to see?
Yeah, I think they're operating kind of like just like a lot of buyers are pretty good buyers. You know, they're lending, but I think they want to see they're trying to assess kind of the effect of the pandemic and is the business beyond it and sort of their current performance sustainable going forward. So I think I don't think I think they will discount the amount of money, you know, the size of what they're willing to lend into, the size of the transaction, size of the loan, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I get the sense that's happening, but they're, you know, they're working with it too, much in the same way any buyer's working it as well. You know, they haven't stopped lending, put it that way.
Yeah. So there's risk for the buyers, there's risk for the bankers. And again, I really appreciate what you created with this risk assessment factors tool, because it shows a level of research and a level of wanting to understand more about the seller business to do a better job of taking them to market, finding the right kind of buyers, and getting them the best deal that you can possibly get on.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
All right. Well, we've got a couple more topics coming up for the next time we talk, but I think we've done a good job with these ones today. Thanks for talking about the pandemic. I think there's some good nuggets in there for sellers to listen to, and we'll pick it up again the next time with a few more topics.
You wanted to jump in that lake behind you there.
I know. I'm out. I gotta go.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Take care.
All right. We'll talk to you.
Bye-bye. If you're thinking of selling your business now or someday, reach out to Jeff or me to begin this important conversation. Thank you.